A woman Googled how to poison someone. Then she invited 4 people over for lunch. 3 of them died. A serial killer walked free for 20 years. He got caught by a Sprite bottle pulled out of a trash can. And a 17-year-old girl got driven to the airport by her housemates. The cameras showed the car never stopped. She never went inside the terminal. This is the dark side of Australia's internet. Volume 2. On July 29, 2023, Erin Patterson invited 4 people over for lunch at her home in Leongatha, a small rural town in the state of Victoria, about 85 miles southeast of Melbourne. The menu was beef Wellington, a fancy, elaborate dish, the kind of meal you make when you want to impress someone. 3 of the 4 guests died over the following days. The 4th barely survived, and when police started going through the search history on Erin Patterson's phone, what they found was enough to freeze any investigator in their tracks. Erin Patterson was 48 at the time of the events. She was a mother of 2 and had been separated from her husband, Simon Patterson, for years. The split hadn't been friendly, there was tension, built-up history, resentments that Erin laid out in private Facebook messages with friends, with a bluntness that would later prove devastating at trial. "I'm so sick of this shit, I want nothing to do with them," she wrote in December 2022, referring to her ex-husband's family. "This family, I swear to God." But on the outside, Erin kept up a completely different image. She was kind, thoughtful, the involved mom who was trying to keep things civil with her kids' family, the one who threw lunches, the one who cooked for people. And on July 29th, 2023, she invited Simon's parents, Don and Gail Patterson, both 70, along with Gail's sister, Heather Wilkinson, 66, and Heather's husband, Ian Wilkinson, 68. She said she wanted to talk about something important, something to do with the kids. She wanted to make amends. Simon was invited too. He declined. His ex-wife scared him. He'd stopped eating food she cooked a while back, though he never imagined anyone else would be at risk. The lunch went down in what seemed like a totally normal way. Good conversation, good food. Erin served individual portions of beef Wellington, a choice that would later become a central piece of evidence in the case because the recipe she used called for a single large piece, not individual portions. Over the next few days, all 4 guests started feeling really sick. The symptoms were consistent with severe poisoning, vomiting, abdominal pain, progressive liver failure. All 4 were hospitalized. On August 4th, 6 days after the lunch, Gail Patterson and Heather Wilkinson died. The next day, Don Patterson died. Ian Wilkinson, the only survivor, spent weeks in intensive care. The doctors who treated him said it was a miracle he made it. The cause of death was confirmed by forensic analysis, poisoning from Amanita phalloides mushrooms known as death cap mushrooms, the deadliest mushrooms in the world. A single death cap can kill a healthy adult. Erin Patterson spoke to police voluntarily. She said it must have been an accident, that she'd bought the mushrooms at an Asian grocery store in Melbourne, that she had no idea death caps were mixed in, that she was so deeply sorry. Police started digging, and the first thing they did was go through her internet search history. What they found was a timeline that the prosecution would describe at trial as the most damning proof of premeditated intent. Weeks before the lunch, Erin had Googled detailed information about death cap mushrooms, about their symptoms, about how long they took to act, about whether they could be detected in food, about the lethal dose. She'd also looked up information on the mushroom dehydration process, a process that, according to the forensic experts who testified at trial, concentrates the death cap toxins and makes them even more lethal and even harder to detect in the final preparation. And then there was the dehydrator. Erin had a food dehydrator in her house. When police went looking for it as part of the investigation, it was gone. Days after her guests died, Erin had taken it to a public trash bin in a commercial area of Leongatha, a bin where appliances don't get picked up. Police found it. Forensic analysis confirmed the dehydrator had been used to process mushrooms containing death cap toxins. Erin said she'd thrown it out because it was broken, that it had nothing to do with the mushrooms from the lunch, that it was a coincidence, but the hardest coincidence to explain was the one with the individual portions. The prosecution argued that Erin had served the beef Wellington in separate portions, so she could control exactly what went on each plate, so she could contaminate her guests' plates without contaminating her own. The analysis confirmed that Erin's portion didn't contain death cap mushrooms. Her 4 guests' portions did. The defense tried to argue that it was an accidental difference in how the ingredients got distributed, that there was no way Erin could have identified and separated the mushrooms with that kind of precision, that the whole thing was a tragedy, not a crime. The jury didn't buy it, but there's one more detail that came out after the conviction, one the defense had wanted to keep out of the trial, and that a judge ordered made public in August 2025. Simon Patterson, Erin's ex-husband, testified at a pre-trial hearing that wasn't presented to the jury. He said that in the months leading up to the fatal lunch, he'd had strange symptoms after eating food Erin made, on occasions when they still shared the odd meal for the kids' sake. "I thought there was a risk she'd poison me if I went to the lunch," he stated. "That's why I declined." That statement never reached the jury, but it did come out after the conviction when the judge lifted the publication ban. And there's more. The prosecution had initially charged Erin with 3 counts of attempted murder against Simon between November 2021 and September 2022, curry and pasta he'd eaten and felt sick after. Those charges were dropped before the trial due to a lack of direct evidence. But the timeline suggests the lunch on July 29th wasn't the first attempt. The trial started in April 2025. It lasted 9 weeks. More than 50 witnesses testified. All of Australia followed it in real time. The media described it as the most closely followed criminal case in the country in decades. On July 7th, 2025, the jury deliberated for 6 days and delivered its verdict. Erin Patterson, guilty of 3 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. She showed no emotion when the verdict was read. She just blinked repeatedly. On September 8th, 2025, she was sentenced to 3 concurrent life terms with a minimum non-parole period of 33 years. She'll be 83 before she can apply for release. The judge told her in the courtroom, "Your actions were deliberate, calculated, and covert." What was the motive? That question never got a definitive answer at trial. The prosecution wasn't required to prove motive, only intent. And intent was established by the Google searches, by the dumped dehydrator, by the individual portions, by the absence of a death cap on her own plate. But Australia kept asking why. What drove a 48-year-old woman, a mother of 2, to plan and carry out the poisoning of 4 people who came to her home in good faith? The Facebook messages, "I'm so sick of this shit. I want nothing to do with them," gave a hint of the built-up frustration. The situation with the separation, the tension with her ex's family, the years of conflict she described in private as unbearable. But the connection between that frustration and the decision to kill 3 people with poisonous mushrooms is a chasm that no psychological analysis could fully cross during the trial. The digital component of this case is what makes it part of this series. It's not a social media case or a dark web case or cybercrime in the traditional sense, but it's one of the clearest cases in Australian legal history of how a person's search history can build the evidence of a premeditated crime. Erin Patterson Googled how to poison someone. Not in those exact words, but the sequence of searches, the timing, the specificity of the information she looked up, told that story more clearly than any witness could. Internet searches don't lie. And in this case, they said exactly what the prosecution needed them to say. Our next case also comes from Australia. It also has decades of history behind it, but this case isn't about poison or a lunch table. It's about 3 women who vanished from the streets of Perth in less than 2 years, about an investigation that cost $140 million and took 20 years to identify the culprit, and about how digital evidence and DNA, 2 tools that didn't exist when the crimes began, were ultimately what cracked the case. I'm talking about the Claremont serial killer. In the previous case, we talked about a crime planned with digital meticulousness, Google searches, a dehydrator tossed in a dumpster, individual portions of beef Wellington. A modern crime, traceable, solved in large part by the killer's digital history. Our next case is different in almost every way. It happened in the 90s, before Google existed, before phones were smart, before there were cameras on every corner. 3 women vanished from the streets of Perth in 14 months. And Australia took 20 years to find the person responsible. Perth, Western Australia, a city that back in the 90s had a reputation as one of the safest and most pleasant in the country. Perfect weather, beaches, quality of life, the kind of place where women went out at night without thinking too hard about danger. That changed forever on January 27th, 1996. It was the early morning of Australia Day, the Australian equivalent of the American 4th of July. Thousands of people partying all over the city. In Claremont, an affluent suburb in Perth's north, full of bars and clubs, the party was in full swing. Sarah Spears was 18. She was a secretary. That night, she'd gone out with friends to the club Bayview in Claremont. Around 2 a.m., she split off from the group and called a cab from a payphone. The cab never showed, or it showed, and couldn't find her. Sarah vanished. Her body was never found. Perth went on high alert. Police investigated. They questioned hundreds of people. There was no concrete evidence, no clear witnesses, nothing that pointed to a specific suspect. 5 months later, on June 9th, 1996, Jane Rimmer went out with friends to them bars in Claremont. Jane was 23 and worked at a daycare. It was the last stop of an ordinary night. She was last seen being approached by someone on the street near the bars. She vanished. Her body was found 2 months later in a wooded area about 28 miles south of Claremont. She had wounds to her neck. She tried to defend herself. Perth realized it had a serious problem. Police formed a special task force. Perth filled up with warnings. Women started being more careful, going out in groups, calling before heading off alone. And even so, on March 14th, 1997, Ciara Glennon disappeared. Ciara was 27. She was a lawyer, smart, successful, with her whole life ahead of her. She'd gone out with colleagues to the bars in Claremont. When the group decided to head home, Ciara chose to stay a little longer and grab her own cab afterward. She never made it home. Her body was found 3 weeks later in a remote area north of Perth, near Eglinton. Same neck wounds, same signs of a struggle, same brutality. 3 women in 14 months, all in Claremont, all alone, all approached by someone who took them away and killed them. Perth was never the same. What followed was the longest, most expensive, and most complex criminal investigation in the history of Western Australia. Police created the biggest task force the state had ever seen. They took DNA samples from more than 2,000 Perth taxi drivers. They interviewed thousands of people. They went through phone records, credit card records, security camera footage from the area. They offered rewards. They even brought in David Burney, a convicted Perth serial killer, to offer some perspective on the killer's psychology. Nothing. For years, absolutely nothing. For 2 decades, the Claremont murders stayed Australia's biggest criminal mystery. Every anniversary, the media would come back to the case. The victims' families gave interviews begging for answers. Police would relaunch appeals to the public, and the killer was still out there. What finally cracked the case wasn't a witness. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't any classic police method. It was a silk kimono. In 1988, 8 years before the Claremont crimes, an 18-year-old woman in Perth was attacked while she slept in her home. The intruder came in through a window, sexually assaulted her, and fled. On his way out, he left behind a white silk kimono he'd stolen off a clothesline at the house next door. The case was investigated at the time with no results, but the kimono was preserved as evidence. In 2016, as part of a massive review of unsolved cases, police analyzed the stains on the kimono with DNA techniques that didn't exist in 1988. The DNA profile they got was compared against the preserved samples from the scene where Ciara Glennon's body was found, specifically the cellular material found under Ciara's fingernails, which indicated she'd fought with her attacker and scratched his skin. They matched. The same man who had attacked the woman in 1988 had killed Ciara Glennon in 1997, but they still had to figure out who he was. The DNA profile was compared against the available databases. There was no direct match, but the investigation revealed that the kimono also had a partial fingerprint from the same intruder from 1988. That print was run against police records, and a match came up. Bradley Robert Edwards, 48, a Telstra technician, Telstra being the largest telecommunications company in Australia. Edwards had been convicted in 1990 for assaulting a social worker at a hospital. A minor conviction, a suspended sentence. His prints were in the system. Police started quietly keeping tabs on him, and at some point, a detective who was tailing him saw Edwards drink a bottle of Sprite. When he tossed it, the detective fished it out of the trash can. The DNA from the Sprite bottle matched the DNA from the kimono, and the DNA under Ciara Glennon's fingernails. On December 19th, 2016, 21 years after Sarah Spears disappeared, police went to Bradley Robert Edwards' home in Kewdale, Perth. They arrested him. Edwards was everything no one would expect from a serial killer. He was a telecommunications technician. He'd worked for Telstra for years, which gave him access to information about phone lines, call records, communications infrastructure. He was a father. He'd been married twice. His ex-wives testified at trial that they'd never seen any signs of violence. But there was also another Edwards, the one who existed in the online world under nicknames he chose for himself. He called himself the Bogeyman on online forums and communities. It was an identity he built that the prosecution presented at trial as evidence of a conscious, deliberate predatory psychology. The trial began in November 2019. It lasted 7 months, the longest criminal trial in the history of Western Australia. More than 200 witnesses testified. The proceedings cost roughly 140 million Australian dollars, the most expensive single trial in the country's history. There was no jury. Edwards chose to be tried by a judge alone, Justice Stephen Hall, because 20 years of media coverage made it nearly impossible to find jurors without pre-existing opinions. On September 24th, 2020, Justice Hall read his verdict. Bradley Robert Edwards, guilty of the murder of Jane Rimmer, guilty of the murder of Ciara Glennon, not guilty of the murder of Sarah Spears due to insufficient direct evidence. But the judge added something significant. He said it was likely that Edwards had also killed Sarah. There just wasn't enough evidence to convict him beyond a reasonable doubt. Sarah Spears is still missing. Her family still doesn't have a body to bury. On December 23rd, 2020, Edwards was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 40 years before he could apply for parole. He'll be 91 before he's eligible. There are several layers to this case that make it unique. The first is time. 20 years. an entire city that lived in fear for 2 decades, families that grew old waiting for answers, investigators who devoted their careers to a case that seemed unsolvable. The second is technology. Edwards wasn't caught by any classic police investigation method. He was caught by DNA, a technology that didn't exist when he committed his first crimes in 1988, by a kimono that someone had the wisdom to preserve for 28 years, by a bottle of Sprite pulled out of a trash can. And the third layer, the one that connects this case to this series, is Edwards' online world. A man who in his public life was a telecom technician, a family man, an invisible neighbor, but who online called himself the bogeyman, who built a digital identity that his real life would never have tolerated. The duality between who he was on the outside and who he was on the inside, and the space the internet gave him to exist as that second self, is part of the story of Bradley Robert Edwards. The Claremont case changed Australia in permanent ways. It changed how Perth talks about safety at night. It changed police protocols for missing persons investigations. It led to reforms in how evidence is preserved and analyzed in unsolved cases, and it left a question that no conviction can fully answer. What would have happened if someone had caught Edwards in 1988 when he assaulted that 18-year-old woman? Would there have been a Sarah Spears, a Jane Rimmer, a Ciara Glennon? The system processed him in 1990. It gave him a suspended sentence, and it let him go. 7 years later, he was on the streets of Claremont. Our last case for today is completely different. There's no convicted culprit. There's no body found. There's no resolution. It's the case of a 17-year-old girl who, in May 2025, was dropped off at an airport by her family. She never checked in for the flight. And from that day on, Australia keeps searching for her without finding any answers. This is the story of Phoebe Bishop. In the previous case, we talked about 20 years of mystery, about an entire city that lived in fear for 2 decades, waiting for someone to answer what had happened to 3 women. And when the answer came, it came thanks to technology that didn't exist when the crimes happened. Our last case for today also has a mystery at its center. It also has a missing teenager. It also has a desperate search. But this case happened in 2025, and the people who drove her to the airport, the people she trusted most, turned out to be exactly who the police were looking for. On May 15th, 2025 at 8:30 in the morning, Phoebe Bishop was on Airport Drive in Bundaberg, Queensland, the road that leads to the airport in that city in northern Australia. She was 17. She had a suitcase. She had a flight booked from Bundaberg to Brisbane, and from there to Perth in Western Australia, where her boyfriend was waiting for her. Her housemates had driven her there. She got out of the car with her suitcase, and she never went into the airport. The security cameras at the Bundaberg airport never captured Phoebe Bishop inside the terminal. The airlines confirmed she never checked in. Her phone was switched off at 8:30 in the morning, the same moment she was dropped off on Airport Drive. Her boyfriend waited. She didn't show. He texted her. She didn't answer. Her family started calling. Nothing. The next day, May 16th, 2025, Queensland police issued a missing person alert. Phoebe Bishop, 5 feet 11 inches tall, long red-dyed hair, hazel eyes, had vanished without a trace. To understand what happened, you have to understand Phoebe's living situation in the months leading up to it. Phoebe didn't live with her family. She lived on a rural property in Gin Gin, a small town about 225 miles north of Brisbane, with 2 housemates, James Wood, a 34-year-old man, and his partner Tanika Bromley, 33. The relationship between Phoebe and her housemates wasn't entirely clear to her family. They knew it existed, they knew they lived together, but the details of that arrangement, who Wood and Bromley really were, what the nature of their relationship with Phoebe was, what went on at that rural property, weren't transparent. What was clear is that it was Wood and Bromley who drove her to the airport that morning of May 15th. They confirmed as much to police themselves at first. Investigators deemed the disappearance suspicious almost immediately. The lead detective, Ryan Thompson, said it at a press conference. "People don't just vanish." It was a simple but blunt line, a sign that police were no longer looking for a teenager who decided to run away. They were investigating something darker. They declared 2 crime scenes: the Gin Gin property where Phoebe lived, and the gray Hyundai X35 with license plate 414EW3 that had been used to take her to the airport. The car was impounded. The property was cordoned off and put through forensic analysis. And on the property they found something disturbing: several dead dogs. Police didn't confirm whether they were connected to the investigation, but the detail made the rounds in every Australian media outlet and painted a very dark picture of what might have happened inside. Phoebe's social media, her bank accounts, and her phone had all been inactive since May 14th, the day before her supposed trip to the airport. The day before. The search intensified over the following weeks. Queensland police deployed tracker dogs, helicopters, and dive teams in the wooded and water areas near Goodnight Scrub National Park. a remote, sprawling national park on the outskirts of Jinjin. Phoebe's mother, Kylie Johnson, spoke publicly. She described the disappearance as completely out of character, especially because it had happened during a week of family grief, coinciding with the death anniversaries of Phoebe's best friend and her grandfather. "She would never have chosen not to show up this week," Kylie said. "This isn't Phoebe." Australian social media filled up with the case. The hashtag with her name was trending in Australia for days. Thousands of people shared her photo, her details, the police contact info. It was the biggest online citizen search in Australia in 2025. On June 4th, almost 3 weeks after the disappearance, James Wood was taken into police custody. Police said he was assisting with inquiries. There were no charges yet. Hours before being taken into custody, Wood had spoken with Daily Mail Australia. He'd told the reporter the details of how they'd driven Phoebe to the airport that morning, that they'd dropped her off on the street, that she'd gotten out of the car with her suitcase. It was the story that fit with what police knew, that Phoebe had been seen on Airport Drive. But there was one detail Wood didn't know the police already had. The security cameras showed the gray car passing along Airport Drive without stopping. No one had gotten out of the vehicle. Phoebe never got out of the car. On June 5th, 2025, Queensland police announced the arrests. James Wood, 34, charged with murder and 2 counts of interfering with a corpse. Tanika Bromley, 33, charged with murder and 2 counts of interfering with a corpse. The next day, June 6th, investigators found what they'd been looking for. Phoebe Bishop's remains were found near Goodnight Scrub National Park, the same area where police had been searching for weeks. She was 17. The Phoebe Bishop case has a digital component that makes it part of this series in ways different from the previous cases. It wasn't the crime itself that happened online, it was the citizen investigation that unfolded in parallel to the official one. From the very first day of the disappearance, Australian users on Reddit, on Facebook, on TikTok, and on Twitter started analyzing every detail police made public. They traced the gray car's route, they analyzed dash cam footage shared on social media, they identified inconsistencies in the versions going around, they made maps of the Goodnight Scrub National Park area, marking possible search zones. When Wood spoke with Daily Mail Australia hours before being taken into custody, and when the information came out that the cameras showed the car never stopping, the Australian online community processed the contradiction in real time before police made their official announcement. It was the same phenomenon we saw in the Colmenares case in Colombia. The internet as a second courtroom, as a parallel field of investigation, as a place where a society collectively processes a crime it finds impossible to ignore. But there was also something darker. Social media had filled the suspects' profiles with threats. The Jinjin property was identified, and its address circulated publicly. People claiming to know Wood and Bromley started posting information about their history, their backgrounds, their past behaviors, unverified information mixed in with rumors, shared by thousands of people who wanted justice for Phoebe, but who in the process were building a parallel trial with no confirmed evidence. That's the darker side of online citizen investigation. Not bad faith, but speed. The certainty with which a community can condemn someone before a court verdict even exists, and the collateral damage that certainty can cause when it gets it wrong. In Phoebe Bishop's case, police arrived at the same suspects the internet had pointed to, but that's not always how it goes. And the line between citizen investigation and digital lynching is thinner than it seems when you're on the side of the people who believe they're doing justice. As of the recording of this video, James Wood and Tanika Bromley are in custody in Australia, awaiting trial. They've made no public statements about the charges. Their lawyers have asked that the case be handled with the utmost discretion given the level of media exposure. The trial doesn't have a date set yet. Phoebe's mother, Kylie Johnson, spoke with the media after her daughter's remains were discovered. She didn't talk about the accused. She talked about Phoebe, about who she was, about what she loved. She said Phoebe wanted to work with animals, that she was affectionate, that she made everyone laugh. And she said something that stuck with Australia. She didn't deserve this. No girl deserves this. That was Australia, Volume 2. 3 cases. 3 different ways the digital world got tangled up with crime in the largest country in the Southern Hemisphere. A woman who Googled how to poison someone and thought it would never leave a trace. A serial killer who walked free for 20 years until a Sprite bottle pulled out of a trash can gave him up. And a 17-year-old girl who was driven to the airport by the people she trusted most and never went into the terminal. What country should I cover in my next video? Let me know in the comments. See you soon.